Hello, and welcome back to the Ship of Thesis and our Crusader Kings 3 tutorial series. Before we launch right into the video, I'd like to start with an immediate caveat, which is this video is not for everyone. If you are a stat nerd, if you like understanding game mechanics in depth, and you really want to get to the nuts and bolts of how things work, this is the video for you. If you just want a really quick and dirty explanation of how things work and you're a filthy casual and you just want to get to play, then watch my previous video, which should appear somewhere on the screen. Anyway, caveats aside, I'm now going to tell you the content that we're going to discuss in this video and the next video very, very quickly. So, in this video, we're going to take a look at pregnancy and how that works. We're going to deep dive into all of the stats so that you're just aware of how fertility actually works. We are also then going to take a look at the concept of dominant and recessive genes and how you can make sure that you are getting the correct genetic legacy inside of your dynasty. In the next video, we'll then further on discuss that by taking a look at the strategies that we can employ both within our dynasty and outside of it to make sure that we're getting exactly what we want. So, that's at least a minute's intro. Let's get straight into the content of the video and start talking about pregnancy. So, obviously, pregnancy is a really good place to start because, unless you actually have children, then you aren't going to be passing on any genetic material, not unless you're particularly talented. So, in this particular case, I'm starting with Petty King Murchad here. He is unmarried, and we're just going to click on the spouse, and I'm going to pick Princess Maria here. And the only reason that we're doing this in the game right now is because I just wanted to demonstrate that it does actually give you the chance of children inside of the marriage dialogue, but it's very, very much obfuscated. Chance of children medium. What does that even mean? Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to deep dive into almost all, but not everything, that goes into the calculation around pregnancy. Some of it does and doesn't make sense to me, but I'm going to try and explain it as best I can. So, here we go with our first chart. Okay, so this is the first table that I'm going to show you through the course of this video, and it has been obtained from the Crusader Kings 3 Wikipedia page, which is a font of veritable awesome information I would recommend that you check out if you are so inclined. Other sources that I will use today are the game files themselves, and just my kind of empirical study of the game. I've tested a few things out just to, verify how things actually work. So it's a mixture of Wikipedia, game files, and just some knowledge that I've accrued over time. So, just to explain this chart that you can see in front of you right now, this is basically just a table that gives you the gender and age effects on the fertility modifier that applies to characters within Crusader Kings 3. So, as you can see from this, females kind of suffer the short end of the stick. Their fertility modifier drops off, or starts to drop off, once they hit 26 years of age, and it drops off completely once they hit 46. Whereas men stay pretty virulent throughout their life cycle. Getting to like 50 or 60 years age in this game is pretty good going. So you're unlikely to really use the ones that are on the right hand side of this table. So it's worth bearing this in mind, that obviously you want to marry into a younger woman if you are a man, and likewise if you're a woman you want to kind of make sure you get married and have kids pretty quickly, otherwise it's going to become harder as the game goes on. Other things that you need to consider off the back of this are your sexuality. I couldn't actually find decent reference to this inside of the game files, but I think that homosexual and asexual basically have a negative 80 or 90% modifier towards your ability to have kids. It doesn't mean you can't have kids, because there are other modifiers that like kick in, but it just makes it that much harder. There's nothing you can really do about that. A character is or isn't a particular sexuality, but it's just worth bearing in mind if you're going to propose a marriage, check out the sexuality before you do so. And on top of that, there is the sexuality of heterosexual and bisexual, and these, as far as I can tell, don't have any impact on the sexuality, or any impact on the fertility modifier, I should say. So they use these base values here. So these are the base unmodified values. They don't mean, if you are reading this table, that if you are a man between the age of 16 and 25 and you have a female who's between the age of 16 and 25, that you're guaranteed to have a child. It just means that the modifier that gets applied to the calculation is at 100% at that point. And we're going to kind of see that next. I'm going to click the button now, and you're going to see a bunch of game files appear. Don't panic, I'm going to describe them all. These are all just things that I think are interesting, and I've kind of cherry picked the stuff that I think is relevant to when you're considering how pregnancy works inside of the game. So, first up, we've got base number of children per couple. All this effectively means is how many kids can you have inside of a coupling. So this is limited based on the actual tier of the characters. So if you are unlanded or a baron or a count, it basically adds up in there. So if you're unlanded, it's 1. If you are a baron, it is 1. If you're a count, it is 2. If you're a duke, it is 3. A king, it is 5. An emperor, it is 5. And as you can see below, there's also extra children for rulers. So you're basically getting +2 just for being a ruler. And given that you are a player character, you will be a ruler. Because if you're not a ruler at any point, then you've lost the game. So in actual fact, your top limit is 7 as an emperor, and if you were a count, it would be 4. So I believe this is also a soft limit, so don't panic too much about it. It's just something that the game utilizes, and I think it affects the AI a lot more than it affects player characters. So the next thing that I thought was worth including were all of these fertility modifiers that get displayed just below there, which you can see mother fertility reduction per previous child, and you can see that that's at 0.5, which is basically 5%. So every time a woman has a child, then she loses 5% of her fertility. So that's worth bearing in mind if you're looking to find a decent spouse and you find someone who's of a decent age, if you look at the chart above, but she's already had 4 kids, then she's already going to have suffered a 20% debuff to her fertility before you even consider her age. So just bear that in mind when you're looking for a spouse. Likewise, there's then the primary, secondary, concubine, and not spouse fertility modifier. So I thought that these were worth including because basically when it becomes primary or not spouse, which basically means your wife or your lover, then there's no kind of negative impact. But if it's a secondary spouse or a concubine, then they're actually taking a 0.5 modifier, which means that you can't rely on your concubines or your secondary wives, if your religion allows it, to actually generate your heirs for you because they're already taking a 50% cut to whatever their fertility modifier is before they even start. So I thought that was worth including. There's the non-ruler fertility modifier. Again, that doesn't really affect you as a player character, but it will affect people who you may be trying to breed with. So just bear it in mind that they have a 15% reduction of their ability to have kids. Lastly, I chucked in the fertility chance multiplier. I don't fully understand this myself. It's 4.75 multiplied by whatever your fertility modifiers are above. And like I said, I don't entirely get it, but I know that the game checks every single month for it. And that would seemingly suggest that the average is about 5% per month. But I think that can't be true because I seem to see more children than that. But hey ho, I mean, like I said, I thought I'd include it for completeness' sake. But yeah, I don't fully understand that particular one. So that's everything I think you need to know about pregnancy. We're now going to move on to looking at the concept of dominant and recessive genes, and we're going to flip between looking at things in the game and looking through my wonderfully curated slides. They get a little bit nicer to look at from here on in, so there will be no more splurted game file code everywhere. Anyway, let's get on with it. So, from a game point of view, the concept of dominant and recessive genes is really quite easy to understand, as long as you know where to look. So if we look at Petty King Murjad here, we can see that he has a dominant gene. He has the fecund gene, which is a physical trait, and it is congenital. If you check any of these traits and they say congenital, it means that it can be passed on. If you can see it listed, then it is a dominant gene. If you can't see it listed, then it means that either he doesn't have it, or it means that it's recessive. So in this case, if he didn't have the fecund trait and we clicked on his father and we saw that his father had the fecund trait, then there's a pretty strong likelihood that he would have it recessively. It's not guaranteed, and we will kind of go into the numbers on that next. But you know, there's a pretty strong likelihood. And that's how you tell, looking inside of the game, whether or not somebody has something. Likewise, if we go back to the marriage screen again and we pick Princess Maria here, then we can see that it tells us which traits will be inheritable from any coupling. The chance of children in this scenario now has gone to very high, and that's because we're giving ourselves a plus 50% fertility modifier, which is awesome. And likewise, we may actually pass on this trait when the breeding actually does happen. So if you want to know if you have it recessively, you should be able to find out, I believe, by clicking on this arrange marriage here to do it that way. But we're now going to deep dive into the mechanics of how dominant and recessive genes actually work. So here we go. Okay, so it's another table, but it's a lot easier to understand than the last one. So this is just basically a combination table of whether or not you do or do not have a gene, and if you do have it, do you have it recessive or dominant? And what this gives you is the percentage chance that that gene will be passed on as a dominant gene. So basically, this is, will this gene be passed on and appear on your character's portrait, as we basically just showed you inside of the game. So I'm not going to read this table for you. You can read it in front of you, right? But you can basically see that it's a lot more likely to be passed on as a dominant gene if both parents are dominant. It's almost impossible. I've put 0%. You actually can get congenital traits appear out of nowhere, but it's quite unlikely, and maybe that's a topic for a different video. But for now, in terms of passing it on from one parent or down to their children, or both parents down to their children, the chance is 0. It could randomly happen, but it's nothing to do with either the father or the mother. And yeah, like if they have a dominant and recessive combination, it does change the likelihood. Having recessive genes makes it less likely. Having dominant genes makes it more likely. So if we go to the next table, we can now see this is the percentage chance using the same format to say whether or not they will get that gene recessively. So if basically the game does a bunch of dice rolls. So if in the first dice roll you don't get the gene dominantly, it then does a secondary dice roll to see if you get that gene recessively. Now, I appreciate these tables, whilst it's a pretty simple table to read, it doesn't necessarily translate into being easy to understand. So what I've done now is I've created a number of diagrams to hopefully explain how this works from an inheritance perspective. I've put a fair bit of effort into it, so hopefully it does help really break this down and make it as straightforward as possible. So let's have a go, shall we? Okay, so we're going to start off with the assumption that Petty King Merchad has the fecund trait, so F stands for father as opposed to female in this particular instance, and M therefore stands for mother, and we're going to assume that Maria, as she does not possess any congenital traits that we're particularly interested in right now. And we're going to breed them, and we're going to breed them 5 times, and this is what we would expect to see based on the previous 2 tables that I've already displayed you. So in the first dice roll, we had a 25% chance, because he has the dominant gene and she has no gene whatsoever, that we would get the fecund trait. So out of 5 kids, 1 of them popped out with the fecund trait. Lucky for us. 3 of those children, I've given these partial circles here to indicate a recessive gene. So this basically means fecund did get passed on in almost all the other circumstances, but it just got passed on recessively. So it's not going to appear on their character portrait, and chiefly, it's not going to have an active effect. So the dominant gene, fecund here, that's going to give plus 50% to Petty King Merchad's child that got fecund. All of his other kids here, it does not. And you can see this last unfortunate child, the 5th one, they didn't get the trait at all. So they won't be passing it on to their children, or at least they won't be passing it on because of them. It might get passed on because of their spouse. So that's the first easy example to kind of display to you. If we click the next example, I'm going to show you how to continue this. Once we've got the fecund trait into one of our children, what we then want to do is try and reinforce that trait. So what I'm doing here is I'm using this oval to indicate people who are outside of our dynasty. So in this case, we're taking somebody outside of our current bloodline, we're breeding them into our bloodline where they have the fecund trait. Now, obviously, it would be extremely important that we make sure that the marriage that happens there is of our dynasty. So if it's the father, then we're, depending on whether the child is a man or a woman, we'd either need to marry them matrilineally or patrilineally. So make sure you do the right one. But if you marry a fecund child to a fecund character, then you can see suddenly we dramatically increase the odds of us passing on the fecund trait. In fact, we almost guarantee it. Now, it's not 100% guaranteed, but it's 80% likely that it's going to be passed on as a dominant gene, which is ace, because now they're going to be really breedable. And it's almost certain that if that doesn't happen, that it will be passed on recessively, which means if we do some further breeding, as I've done here, I've bred one of the recessive children to another external person who has fecund, and because now I'm including fecund with recessive fecund, I've got a 50% likelihood that I'll get it dominantly, as opposed to up here where I only had a 25% likelihood. And if I don't get it, then I'm pretty likely again to get it recessively. So I've at least made sure that it stayed inside of my bloodline by marrying someone who had the gene recessively to someone who has it dominantly. So hopefully you should see the first big strategy there is to make sure you reinforce a trait. If you have a trait and you want to make sure it stays and you want it to be dominant, then pair dominant with dominant. If you have it recessively, pair it with dominant to increase the likelihood that it will become dominant, or increase the likelihood that it will stay in your bloodline. Because the other potential for the things to happen is that you have over here where it doesn't pass on, and if I load that and we breed them with someone who doesn't have fecund, then that's it. We've lost fecund out of that branch of our bloodline. So this is a really basic level of how it works. Hopefully seeing it in that way makes more sense than just reading the chart, but by all means go back and look at the chart if you prefer looking at base percentages, but hopefully this is a good breakdown of how the general kind of breakdown of how stuff works. So we're going to go a little bit further in our next example. Okay, so this was a pretty straightforward example as things go. We were just taking a single trait and we were trying to breed it in. And as you can see, we reinforced it through multiple generations to make sure that dominant with dominant would mean that it's very likely to stay in our bloodline going ahead. The time that it gets complicated is when you want to take multiple traits and merge them together. And that's pretty much what this entire video series is there for. Creating your master race is more than just having the fecund trait, right? Before we move on, it's worth pointing out these, red no entry signs that I included to say no traits and then where we lost a trait. If you're trying to get rid of a trait, doing this is better. You don't want to keep a trait if it's bad. Fecund is a good trait, but there are plenty of traits like club-footed, for example, that's bad, and you don't want that trait. So you want to try and breed that out. Breed people who have it with people who don't have it to try and get rid of it. Anyway, that should be fairly self-explanatory, but I thought I'd just make sure to actually mention it. So let's move on to the multiple trait example next. Okay, so this is the multiple trait example. In this scenario, we've basically bred a fecund with fecund to make a very strong multiple generation fecund, and we've also done the same, I should say, with the strong trait. So effectively, if we assume these are two branches of our bloodline, then we've got two characters who are ready to be bred and ready to create us awesome characters effectively. So if I click on this now and we breed these two together, this is kind of what we're aiming to get. By breeding fecund and strong together, we want these two traits to combine. And if we do this breeding, it could happen this way, but it's more than likely not going to happen this way. So if I click the next thing, I'm going to put this is ideal, where we've bred these two together and this happened, and then we managed to find someone external. Remember, oval is an external person. So we find somebody external who happens to be fecund and strong, and we breed them, and then we end up with multiple generations of two traits together, so that will keep it in our bloodline. But that's less likely. We're not likely to actually find anybody external to our bloodline who has both fecund and strong, and is fertile, and will marry us. So I'm going to show you this one, which is more likely, which is we can find somebody external to our bloodline who has one of the desirable traits. In this case, I've picked fecund, but it could have been strong. And we're going to have to breed our double trait person with someone with the single trait. And as you can see here, the likelihood that we're going to get that double trait is quite low now. We're likely to get a lot of the trait that we combine, so fecund and fecund will make dominant fecund, but we may even end up with a strong randomly, but eventually we will get the fecund and strong combination that we're looking for. So I thought it was worth pointing that out, and showing you in a more realistic scenario. You're gonna have to do this. Now, the reason why I've pointed this out is because it very much leads into the topic of inbreeding, and that's going to be the focus of our next video. But I wanted to say this now. You're going to try to keep things outside of your bloodline at first. Once you start the first set of multiple traits, try to keep it where you're mixing the blood outside of your bloodline to avoid being inbred, because whilst it's very powerful for combining traits, it also comes with a set of disadvantages, and we're definitely going to discuss that more in the next video. So for now, I'm just going to complete the example, and I'm going to show you a little bit of inbreeding on the next slide, but we're not going to talk too much about it. That's for the next video. So basically, if we take the same scenario that we've just seen, we're going to take the likely scenario. So we're going to take our fecund and strong, and we're going to breed them with someone external who has the fecund trait over here. And these are the children that we're likely to produce. If we then marry, if we decide to get rid of this spouse after we've created the children, and we marry to another spouse who has the strong trait this time and create another child, then we now have two half brothers or sisters that we can potentially breed together, and then that will almost certainly guarantee that we will have the fecund and we will have the strong trait to carry on. And like I said, this is now playing the inbreeding game, so it comes with its own risks, but it is a way for us to guarantee that we've passed on those traits. And if you go back and look at those original tables that I showed you, or go and check them out on the CK3 wiki, then this is kind of mapping the probability back of what things actually look like. This is how you can ensure that you're passing multiple traits on. But all is not lost for these other children. The ones that only came out as fecund and came out as strong are probably still recessive with the other trait. So what you would do in that scenario is you would make sure you marry them to their opposite trait. So in this scenario, I've picked two people who are external to our bloodline again, because that's the safest way. And I've married an external fecund person to my strong person, and they're likely to have had fecund because of this one up here, inside of them recessively, and that means that we're likely to end up creating a double trait again, or I've put the partial circle in there to indicate that if it doesn't, we'll at least get one or both of the traits recessively. So it's a way to keep it in your bloodline. Just be aware that every time you add additional traits to your bloodline, you potentially add weak links to your, DNA chain, basically, and you need to make sure you keep reinforcing them when they disappear. Otherwise, you could lose them. It's not super likely, but it can happen. It's all dice rolls at the end of the day. So that's everything we're going to say this video about how traits get passed on. The last thing that we're going to discuss is the concept of tiered traits. So I guess it's not technically the last thing we were going to say about how traits get passed on, but specifically now we're going to talk about tiered traits. Tiered traits are things like beautiful, genius, stuff like that. There's also bad ones like slow and imbecile, for example, but we're going to use the example of the intelligence traits in our next slide. So here we're going to have a look at the concept of father and mother breeding, who are both quick. Now, quick is the level 1 intellect trait. So if you are breeding two of the level 1 of a trait together, all is well. You are either going to get that trait, or you're going to get a better trait. In fact, I have modeled it for you. So there are a number of dice rolls that happen. When you try to breed a tiered trait, the first dice roll tries to take the maximum trait. So in this scenario, quick will actually do a dice roll to say, will your child become a genius? Now, in theory, based on the calculation from the game files that I can see, that should be a 10% chance. In practice, my empirical testing has shown that you never get genius in this pairing. You will only ever get one tier up, which is intelligent. So if I load this now, you can see half of your children have a chance to actually get the next tier up. So that's on your second dice roll. It's going to determine we didn't get the genius. Let's do a secondary dice roll, and now you get a plus 40% modifier to the chance to get it. And having quick on both of these effectively counts as having a recessive gene for genius, both, and in this case recessive for intelligent for both. And then the plus 40% modifier basically makes it that they have a 50-50 shot of getting an upgrade. Again, if you don't care about the stats, that's fine. Just bear in mind that when you put two traits of the same level together, you've got a pretty much 50-50 shot of getting the upgrade. Where you don't get the upgrade, then you're pretty likely to either get the same level trait on the third dice roll, or you'll get it recessively. There is a very small chance, again, where you won't get the trait at all, but to be honest, with tiered traits, it makes it that much more likely that you're going to get one of the traits, because there's more than one dice roll. When a trait is not tiered, you have a straight up 80-20% split, in the case of two dominant genes like merging together. In the case that we have here, where it's tiered, you're first doing a dice roll to see if you get a higher trait, then you're doing another dice roll to see if you get a higher trait, then you're doing another dice roll to see if you get an active trait that's, you know, a dominant trait here, and then you're doing another dice roll to see if you get it recessively, and then if you don't get that, you're losing the trait. So, you know, that's a lot of dice rolls, and obviously the more that you add, the more likely you are to at least succeed in one of them. So this is a nice easy example. The next one's a little bit more complicated. The next one is if you have a quick person with a genius. So this is the level 1 trait and the level 3 trait. So the min trait and the max trait, basically. So if we load this up, you can see the first dice roll is to determine if we get genius. Now again, from the game files, we shouldn't have this high of a chance. I'm not sure if this is actually a bug. I didn't include the actual maths around this from the files because it doesn't play that way in the game when I tested it. So I could have given you the maths, but it would have been disingenuous. I felt it was better to actually empirically show you what I got during my testing. Whether or not they patch it down the line, I don't know. I don't even know if it's a bug. But this is what I found so far. If you're pairing a quick person with a genius person, you pretty much have a 40% chance of getting genius. Then, on the second dice roll, we're going to see if we get a lower level stat. So in this case, intelligence. Or intelligent, I should say. So we're getting that 40% modifier again. However, because one of the parents has a lower trait, we are actually suffering a debuff. So we're only getting a few of them there. And then lastly, in fact, we did get 4 intelligences. I just screwed up the animation. So lastly, we're doing the roll to see whether or not we get quick. So you can see in this scenario, if you have the quick trait, you want to marry someone who has the genius trait because you have a pretty good chance of upgrading your quick trait to either genius or intelligent, and only a 20% chance of getting quick. Now, again, there is a possibility that you will get this gene recessively or you will lose it completely, but it's that much lower. It's really, really rare at this point. You're much more likely to get an upgraded trait. In fact, from my testing, it looks like you're about 80% likely to get an upgraded trait if you are the father here and you have quick and you're marrying into genius. If we reverse the scenario, let's assume that you are the genius and you marry into quick. That's bad. You're probably going to downgrade. You've got a much higher chance of getting a downgraded trait. So you don't want to do that. So just be aware of, which end of the spectrum you're doing the marriage from. And then lastly, I've done an intelligent. So I should say lastly. Penultimately, I've done intelligent and intelligent. So the first dice roll again is to determine if we get genius. I actually found here that it's 50-50 again. So you're pretty much likely, if you're in the middle tier, to get either the tier that you're already on or the genius trait. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty good. Lastly, I did genius and genius, and it's still possible to skip the trait entirely here, but it's just going to be really rare. And as you can see here, if you're breeding a genius with a genius, then you're almost 80% likely to pass on genius. You may get intelligent, you may get quick. And again, you might get it skip, like I've said at the bottom here, but it's just that much more unlikely. So obviously what you can tell from this is, if you have the genius trait, pair yourself with a genius, you will keep it in the bloodline. If you're intelligent, try and pair it with a genius. If you're quick, try and pair it with a genius. Otherwise, pair it at the same level and it's likely to just upgrade itself. And that's pretty much everything you need to know about tiered traits. And it signals the end of this particular video. So I appreciate this has been a bit of a long one and it's been very, very stat heavy. The next one's going to be much more about the actual strategies that you use to apply to these mechanics to get the most out of things. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Please let me know in the comments if this is the kind of thing that you like. I know this isn't really everybody's cup of tea, and that's why I tried to put a disclaimer at the beginning of the video. But if you liked it, let me know. If you didn't like it, let me know, and I can factor that in when I make my future videos. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.